Γεια σας. Welcome to Greek Like Me, the podcast about all things Greek. I'm your host, Pamela Diartes Wood. Email us at stealthgreek@gmail.com to share comments, questions, and stories about Greeks, Greekness, or your own ethnic background. Slava Ukraine. A little warning. It is March 7th, an incredibly windy day in New Jersey. So the noise you may hear in the background occasionally is crazy wind. Today's episode is about dolmades, stuffed grape leaves, suggested by listener Mary. She writes, "Hello, Pamela. I'm enjoying your podcasts. In a future podcast, would you be able to get to the bottom of who really came up with dolmadakia? The origin of the food may not be the same as the origin of its name." Thank you, Mary. I'm sorry it took us this long to get to dolmades. Our list of topics is long. But talking about food is one of my favorite pastimes. And I especially appreciate that Mary mentions the name of the food doesn't necessarily have anything to do with its origins. This is frequently true with foods that have spread from their point of origin and been incorporated into other cultures. An example is corn, or maíz, a food originating in the Americas, West Central Mexico to be exact, originally called teosinte. It was called maíz by Spanish colonizers and is called maize throughout much of Europe today. Corn is an old English word meaning grain. It's what English colonizers in America called teosinte and what non-Indigenous Americans still call it. Apparently, as seen on TikTok, there are plenty of Europeans who have no clue maíz, maize, or sweet corn came from the Americas. Honestly, a fair number of Americans north of the Mexican border, same. Common terms don't always denote origin. Well, it looks like we're in for another food fight. I thought dolmades might be easier to research than the story of baklava, the episode from February 2023. I knew Armenians, Syrians, Egyptians, Greeks, Iranians, and Turkish people might all lay claim to the origins of stuffed grape leaves. But I didn't anticipate how much time I would spend trying to track down evidence in ancient Greek documents, never mind everybody else's ancient documents. Translated Greek sources are easier to find than English translations from other languages used in ancient times because Europeans, like the Brits, were wild about ancient Greece and were constantly translating this stuff. But many of the original Greek sources exist only in fragments or as references in ancient plays, poems, or histories. We don't have access to every database available because that runs into a lot of money. Along with those translated fragments and some modern documents, we're mostly referencing people who reference ancient Greeks, who in turn reference even more ancient Greeks. Here's what we know. Dolmades, or stuffed grape leaves, is a traditional food in Eastern Mediterranean, Balkan, and so-called Middle Eastern countries. It's a staple, functioning as a satisfying light meal with feta cheese, olives, maybe a nice piece of bread, or as a meze, an appetizer. Growing up in a Greek family, it was regularly part of family meals and holidays and brought out whenever we stopped by the aunties' houses, where it was stocked in the fridge at all times. Some of these wonderful ladies hand-picked the grape leaves from vines in their own backyards. But where did stuffed grape leaves come from originally? Who started the ancient fad of rolling up food in leaves? And why do we call them dolmades? According to UNESCO, the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, the word dolma originates from, quote, the shortened Turkic word doldurma, meaning stuffed. This refers to vegetables like peppers, eggplants, tomatoes, and various leaves. Alan Davidson, in the Oxford Companion to Food, 2014 edition, states, quote, the distribution as well as the name itself indicates that this dish belongs to the court cuisine of the Ottoman Empire. He claims the signs of Turkish origin are clear because of the use of the Turkish word dolma and its appearance throughout the countries dominated by the former empire. Really? Signomi, Mr. Davidson. Don't make me use the M word. This is incredibly lazy research, lack of research. Oknurosine. According to Mr. Davidson's logic, the English or the Spanish first cultivated corn or maize. The indigenous peoples of the American continent had nothing to do with it because Europeans called it maize and it spread throughout Europe. Mr. Davidson, Professor Pamela gives you a D minus. In the 15th century, the Ottoman Empire conquered and occupied a swath of the Mediterranean, Anatolia, and much of the so-called Middle East for over 400 years. Yes, the empire was responsible for some of the spread of dolmas, especially beyond the region, but did the Ottomans create dolmades? Ohipedia. No. Okay, sidebar rant. I know you think you just heard one, but over the years, I have found this lazy kind of extrapolation in non-academic texts over and over. One person says something based on their own incorrect assumptions, and others use them as a source. It's like American politics. Shame on the Oxford Companion to Food and Oxford University Press because they're supposed to be an academic source. With their armies of researchers and editors, this old lady found out more than they did. And with her non-existent budget, I paid for that dang humongous book. Very expensive origami paper now. Stuffed leaves have been around for thousands of years. In the aforementioned Greece, Armenia, Syria, Egypt, Lebanon, Iran, and so on. Thousands of years ago, there were no Ottomans. The Turkic tribes were nomadic and not unified, and did not exist in the region. As we've said in previous episodes, the Turkic tribes originated well east of Asia Minor / Anatolia, near Mongolia, first entering the Anatolian region in the 11th century CE or AD as bands of mercenaries. Later, the Seljuk Empire brought the various Turkic tribes together, invaded parts of Anatolia, later leading to Ottoman dominance in the 15th century. As a nomadic people, it's unlikely Turks were cultivating grapevines, which Greeks and Armenians had been doing for thousands of years. There are no reports I could find of stuffed grape leaves being eaten in the lands Turkic tribes originated from at the time they inhabited them. It's entirely possible they used leaves to wrap food. I mean, that's handy. But everyone in the Turkish camp refers specifically to dolmas as a food of the Ottoman Empire, never as a food eaten by the earlier Turkish nomads. Meanwhile, as we've said, people in the regions the Ottomans eventually conquered had been consuming stuffed leaves, including grape leaves, long before the Turks arrived. Similar to the story of baklava, I'm of the mind the Ottomans adopted dolmades as part of their cuisine and perfected the Turkish version at Topkapi Palace, where the sultans collected the greatest chefs money could buy. Turkish dolmas, delicious. I had some the other day from my favorite local Turkish restaurant, Rumi, in Bloomfield, New Jersey. But they're an adaptation, not an invention. Dolmas did become an important permanent part of Ottoman and later Turkish cuisine, so Davidson got that part right. But much the way pizza became a permanent part of American cuisine. We have our version, we did not invent it. Melanie Panayotopoulou, in her article on the history of dolmades, states, while the Ottoman Empire played a significant role in spreading the dish through its extensive territories, it's important to recognize that the roots of dolmades lie in the ancient culinary traditions of the indigenous peoples of these regions. Those indigenous peoples included Hittites, Armenians, Assyrians, Phrygians, Thracians, who were ancestors of Greeks, Ionian Greeks, who settled in the region in the early 11th century BCE, some 3,000 years before Turks appeared, and others. Ronelle Kirshner, chef, educator, and dietitian in A Historical Look at the Dolma, states after the Turkish conquest of Constantinople in 1453, the dolma became increasingly common fare as the ruling Ottoman Empire expanded. Stuffed grape leaves are repeatedly referred to as a foodstuff in Constantinople long before its fall. Dimitris Kralis, director of Hellenic Studies at Simon Fraser University in Canada, wrote for the Hellenic Communication Service in 2006, quote, a 6th century pre-Islamic Arab source refers to stuffed zucchini and grape leaves as a quintessentially Greek dish. I am working on identifying this source. So, why did this ancient food come to be known as dolma, a Turkish term, convincing Mr. Davidson of its Turkish origin? This is what Mary was talking about. When these areas were conquered by the Ottoman Turks in the 15th century, Turkish culture and language were forcibly imposed on the indigenous peoples for over 400 years. The lingo of the overlords spread throughout the occupied territories, inserting itself into all of their languages. Much as Spanish and later English words became a part of indigenous American language, or how English words became part of the over 120 languages spoken in India. Not to say Greeks, Armenians, and others didn't borrow and adapt foods brought in by the Turks. I'm sure they must have. It's what happens when people live side by side. There are those who will insist the dolma must have come from Topkapi, much like some Brits call curries British food, ignoring its Indian origins. And in the Americas, good Lord, I have an 18th century colonial Virginia cookbook claiming cornbread, forgetting we got the original recipe from the original inhabitants. Colonial powers adopt foods and customs of those they invade, and then, voila, they take credit. The food was there long before the Ottomans appeared on the scene. Okay, so who first stuffed grape leaves? There doesn't seem to be any conclusive evidence, but there are hints. Lazy Cat Kitchen is a nice kind of foodie website, and they make the point similar climates are conducive to relying on the same kind of produce. It's been documented that all of the people throughout the region wrapped food in various types of leaves, going back many, 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 many years. Grapes and wine were already a staple of the Mediterranean Anatolian diets. We know of many instances of sailors and merchants sharing recipes while visiting ports and marketplaces throughout the ancient world. There are countless histories written by ancient travelers. As they traveled, they ate. A number of articles and chef blogs cite the Minoan palace, Knossos, on the Greek island of Crete as the origin of stuffed grape leaves. One famous food blogger said stuffed grape leaves were eaten in Knossos 2,000 years ago. But wait, Knossos was built around 1700 BCE, which is nearly 4,000 years ago. It fell around 1400 BCE, which is 3,500 years ago or so. I would love to be able to say dolmades came from Knossos. I'm biased. That would make it one of the earliest places the food appears, in the Greek world. But the articles I read didn't cite sources. Where's the information coming from? I dug around on HathiTrust for translations of ancient histories of the region with no luck. I can't say it came from Knossos without proof. This is not Fox News. If anyone can share a verifiable source, please email us. Fred Ferretti, in his 1983 New York Times article, Stuffed Grape Leaves Greek Style, claims the Greeks that he interviewed in Athens all said the gods ate them on Mount Olympus, so of course they're Greek. I kind of love that, but it's not exactly proof. On a side note, Ferretti comes off as a bit of a troglodyte, describing Greek and Middle Eastern food as, quote, pungent with unsubtle spices. Meaning not salt and pepper, maybe? Something unfamiliar to the palate doesn't make it unsubtle, Fred. Several articles attribute dolmas absolutely to the Persians, while mentioning the food existed as far back as 3000 BCE, 5,000 years ago. The Persian Empire didn't exist until the 6th century BCE, 550 or so. Encyclopedia Britannica says Persians were an Indo-European nomadic people who migrated into southern Iran to an area then called Persis about 1000 BCE, almost 2,500 years before the Turks. Either way, shortly after, dolmas were largely believed to have already existed in the region. They likely adopted stuffed grape leaves and adapted it to their own tastes. Panayotopoulou states it was the sophisticated cuisine of the Persian Empire that made filling and wrapping grape leaves a more elevated part of the region's cuisine, and that the trendy Persians greatly influenced surrounding regions, like those occupied by Greeks and Egyptians. It was because of them stuffed grape leaves began showing up on the tables of the elite. We're playing with pieces of a puzzle where a bunch of the key pieces are missing. Historians tell us there were around 25 ancient Greek cookbooks, as well as many famous essays on food, making the rounds in classical times. Often these were recipes that had been around for many generations, finally written down. Some of the popular writers about ancient Greek cuisine were Timocharis of Rhodes in the 2nd century BCE, Pax Hamos in the 2nd century BCE, Grape of Samos, 4th century BCE, Aristostratos, Greek Sicilian, 4th century BCE, all sharing what were current and age-old food traditions with their readers. Over the centuries, as power and governments shifted, the original ancient cookbooks weren't considered important enough to be preserved, even though everybody who was anybody in the classical world was talking about them. Important texts had to be copied as the paper deteriorated and then stored in libraries. Luckily, fragments of the cookbooks survived in the form of scrolls, and many of them are referred to or quoted by some of the greatest historians, philosophers, and playwrights of the classical Greek world. Egyptian scholars saved many, many ancient Greek works, preserving them in their libraries. I sometimes wonder if one day a 2,000-year-old Greek reference to dolmades might be discovered. One can dream. Even the famous and much-quoted work of Athenaeus, the 25-volume 2nd century CE masterpiece, Dipnosophiste, only survives in fragments. A lot of fragments. We've added a link in the episode notes to Bill Thayer's website to access a translation, as well as a link to an early 20th century translation available through HathiTrust. Even in fragments, it's a huge work. Food is a major topic in the Dipnosophiste, or Feast of the Sophisticates, but every other aspect of Greek life makes an appearance. Great reading, but no answers on the history of stuffed grape leaves to be found in a cursory read. There is documentation of ancient Greek recipes for thrion, a delicacy of meat, rice, or fruits wrapped in fig leaves. In Eugenia Ricotti's book, Meals and Recipes of Ancient Greece, she writes, "In ancient times, fresh, tender fig leaves called thrion were used instead of grape leaves, and still are in some parts of Greece, with recipes identical to those made of grape leaves." Rice is the most common filling for Greek stuffed grape leaves today, but rice was unknown in ancient Greece, so different grains were used, like spelt or bulgur. According to Ricotti, much of her information comes from the Dipnosophiste, which includes notes on cooking from the time of Homer around the 9th or 8th century BCE, as well as detailed commentary on feasts Athenaeus attended throughout the Hellenic world and beyond. Traveling food critic. I love it. Charles Burton Gulick translated the fragments of the Dipnosophiste in 1927. Stuffed fig leaves was listed on the menu of a great feast attended by Athenaeus. In his supporting notes, Gulick compares the dish to modern Greek stuffed grape leaves. Ancient Greek comic writers were obsessed with thrion, and their plays often went into great detail about food. Of course they did. Radu Gabriel Petre addresses this in his paper Haute Cuisine in Ancient Athens, Investigations into the Dining Habits of a Classical City. He says, food becomes central at times, the pillar, which not only the story of the play revolves, but also its language. Cooks in the plays recite long lists of ingredients and the price of fish. But do any mention grape leaves? Not that I could find. But I haven't read all the plays. But these plays, along with Greek poets and historians, describe fig leaves wrapped around flour, eggs, milk, honey, goat cheese and meat. Athenaeus describes how well the food complements entrails, goats, grasshoppers, and pomegranates, among other things. The Gulick translation at happytrust.org is really delightful. I highly recommend it, and it's free to access. I wasn't able to borrow the Ricotti cookbook from a library, so I bought it, and I'm reading it like a novel. The threon recipe is for 20 fig or grape leaves. I have a fig tree because I'm Greek. Whichever leaves are boiled and spiced. The stuffing includes spelt, broth, onions, and olive oil. It should be cooked in a copper pan, which allows for better heat distribution. A yogurt sauce is poured over the threon when it's time to serve. A lot of this does really sound a lot like grape leaves, minus the rice. Interestingly, the next recipe in the book is for grasshoppers. Greeks ate insects at feasts and at home. They don't do that anymore, unless they're very adventurous. Ricotti says, Greek cuisine from the classical era was very simple. Numerous recipes passed from generation to generation have endured for centuries and come down to us virtually unchanged. So from a time when only 10% of the population was literate, these recipes were handed down orally for a very long time. Teresa Karatsianilos echoes this in the Complete Greek Cookbook, the best from 3,000 years of Greek cooking. This book is a longtime favorite in Greek American kitchens since it came out in 1970. I still have my mother's copy. Yanilos explains early Greeks used fig, mulberry, and hazelnut leaves to cook. The use of grape leaves as a wrap, quote, was born when Alexander the Great demolished Thebes, and food was so scarce the Thebans had to cut the little meat they had into mincemeat and roll it in grape leaves. Initially, I thought this brought us to Egypt as the Greek source for stuffed grape leaves. And I'm not the only one who jumped to that conclusion. Many food blogs refer to Alexander destroying Thebes, the city in Egypt. But as much as I love food blogs, they're not history books, and the history books say it was Thebes, the Greek city-state, founded in 3000 BCE, that fell to Alexander. Thebes rebelled against Macedonian rule, but of course they did. This was the home of the famous fighting Sacred Band of Heroes we talked about in our June 2024 episode. They fell in battle against Alexander's father a few years earlier. But Thebes was known as a rebellious city, and they rebelled against Alexander's Hellenic Macedonia, the historically Greek northern province, very different from the Slavic country that broke off from Yugoslavia and claimed the same name in 1991, now called North Macedonia. Alexander razed the Greek city of Thebes as punishment for their resistance. He later conquered Egypt, yes, but the city of Thebes in Egypt was not destroyed. Encyclopedia Britannica states, in the autumn of 332 BCE, Alexander the Great invaded Egypt and found the Egyptians ready to throw off the oppressive control of the Persians. Alexander was welcomed by the Egyptians as a liberator and took the country without a battle. In the aftermath of the destruction of Hellenic Thebes, foodstuffs and provisions were difficult to come by. Ancient historians report the people of Thebes began rolling up scraps of meat and grape leaves. According to multiple sources, Alexander was so taken with this efficient yet tasty way to have a meal on the go, he made it a regular part of his army's diet and carried the recipe with him during his campaign. And in this way, it spread throughout Greece and to the regions he conquered or battled for, including parts of what is now Pakistan. There are Armenian claims on the existence of stuffed grape leaves in that northwestern area of what was once India. So, did the Greek version of dolmades first appear in the 4th century BCE, where we have documentation, or could it have existed earlier in Greece? I don't know. Susanna Hoffman is another popular cookbook author, an anthropologist and cook who lived, worked, cooked, and educated herself in Greece on and off for over 30 years. Her cookbook, The Olive and the Caper, is a classic. She explores different areas of Greece, sampling the food, interviewing the people. She calls the stuffed grape leaf the most famous Greek dish, first mentioned when Alexander the Great conquered and destroyed Thebes. She says classical Greeks continued to use grape leaves as envelopes for their grains and other tasty morsels. In later times, the Byzantines made the filling with currants, nuts, and Eastern spices, which sounds delicious. Most, if not all, Greek city-states had been creating their version of dolmades with the leaves of various fruit trees for centuries, and presumably added grape leaves after Alexander discovered their use in Greek Thebes. So, Greeks spread dolmades from Thebes when Alexander swept throughout much of the ancient world, including Syria, Armenia, Persia, Anatolia, Phoenicia, Egypt, Mesopotamia, Greater Iran, Afghanistan, and northwestern India. The Ottomans adopted it and spread it during more modern times after the 14th century. Wait a minute. The operator of the website, Swaryayamag, swears dolmas are 100% Armenian, stating, in fact, the first dolma was made in Sarab 3,000 years ago and comprised primarily of grape leaves. I couldn't find documentation for 3,000-year-old grape leaves in this Armenian city, in a province that goes back to the 5th millennium BCE. Maybe it's written in ancient Armenian text I couldn't find access to. The website says dolmas spread throughout the region due to Alexander after he conquered Armenia. But Alexander defeated Thebes first, where it was recorded he ate stuffed grape leaves for the first time, and later moved east in the direction of Armenia. But that doesn't mean Armenia didn't already have stuffed grape leaves on the menu. A paper published by the National Institute of Health, Genetic Diversity of Armenian Grapevines, states, Armenia is a unique grapevine diversity hotspot where viticulture and winemaking date back to the beginning of the 4th millennium BC, which is 6,000 years ago. Greeks had grapevines too 6,000 years ago, but they weren't believed to have been as cultivated to the same extent as the Armenian vines. Wine makes an appearance throughout ancient Greek literature and writings, but the NIH says Armenia is an important country in the origin of cultivated grapevines. Were people eating the leaves of the cultivated vines, or did they eat the leaves of the wild vines first? We don't know. Andrew and Rachel Dalby in Gifts of the Gods, A History of Food in Greece, reference the archaeological remains of a winery in Irene, Armenia, dating back to 4000 BCE. During the same time frame as grape pressings discovered at an archaeological site in northern Greece called Dikili in the town of Kavala. So there was grapevine cultivation happening in both locations, but we have no way of knowing when grape leaves began to be used as a food. If you're thinking Dikili doesn't sound Greek, it's a Turkish term meaning upright stone. Like the rest of modern-day Greece, Kavala was once under Ottoman rule. The site has its own history that we're not going to get into today. Scientists and historians say storage jars containing wine dating to 6,000 BCE, 8,000 years ago, predating both Armenian and Greek finds so far, were discovered in what is now Georgia, north of Armenia and Azerbaijan. By virtue of proximity to Georgia, would Armenia have had access to grapevine cultivation techniques that then spread westward? Georgia has dolmas, which are stuffed vegetables or vine leaves, but I didn't find anything specifically about stuffed grape leaves there going back that far. Greek mythology tells us wine and cultivated grapevines came by way of the god Dionysos, who brought it to Greece from his travels. There are debates, of course, about how far back we can trace Dionysos, who is not included in the original Greek pantheon. But most scholars, as of 2024, agree his worship dates back at least to the Mycenaean era, around 1500 BCE, though he likely existed for some time as a minor god. Does this help us date winemaking in Greece? No. Neolithic Greeks were making wine in some form in 4000 BCE at the Kilitash. But I am curious about where did Dionysos travel from carrying this great innovation? From whence did he bring the grapevine? Honestly, this is detective work, following up on old historical accounts, new information, archaeological evidence, and sifting through misinformation and jingoistic claims of a dozen countries that didn't actually exist in ancient times. And what about those merchants and travelers carrying recipes around the region in ancient times? Thebes is in central Greece, while Armenia is located northeast of Turkey. There were Greek and Armenian cities scattered throughout Anatolia, which lies between them. It's entirely possible travelers thousands of years before Alexander carried stuffed grape leaves to the Hellenic world. But again, no proof. It could have happened the other way around. Also, no proof. In other dolma news, in 2017, UNESCO cited dolmas as a tradition of Azerbaijan, a country east of Armenia, just north of Iran, in a report titled Dolma Making and Sharing Tradition, a Marker of Cultural Identity, recognizing dolmas in Azerbaijan as intangible cultural heritage. The UNESCO Heritage Site proclaims the tradition is present throughout the Republic of Azerbaijan and is perceived as a central culinary practice in all regions. It is enjoyed on special occasions and gatherings and expresses solidarity, respect, and hospitality. It is transmitted from generation to generation and transcends ethnic and religious boundaries within the country. This sounds like all of us who enjoy stuffed grape leaves as a part of our culinary tradition. And it's been a culinary tradition long enough in all of these countries to make it part of our common heritage. The food goes too far back in history to be traced. And the fact that Turkish peoples came late to the stuffed grape leaf tradition doesn't make it any less a part of their culture today. Hoffman explains the stuffed grape leaves in Greece changed over the centuries. In times past, the leaves were used to encase barley or wheat with all sorts of sweet, sharp morsels. Today it is rice and raisins, depending on the area of Greece. My yaya, great-aunt from Kiparissia in the Peloponnesos, never used raisins, nor did the Romanian Greek family Ma's cousin married into. They all made dolmades with rice, onion, dill, and lemon. A good friend from Crete and another from Cyprus made theirs with rice and chopped meat. Other Greeks use rice and pine nuts. Spring is the gathering time for grape leaves when they're young and tender. Traditionally, they were hung in shady places to dry without becoming brittle. After that, the leaves were dipped in boiling water to preserve them for the winter. The Spruce Eats, a foodie website that I really enjoy, explains how to pick and prepare grape leaves or freeze them for future use. We'll post a link on our episode notes. Today, of course, many cooks buy their grape leaves from markets, where they're stored in jars with brine to remain flexible enough to roll. I really enjoyed investigating one of my favorite foods, even though we never came up with a real answer. And it has been making its way onto more restaurant menus in the northeastern U.S. in the last few years. My daughter took them for lunch when she was in grammar school, enduring taunts at the time over her weird food. But before long, a classmate began sharing them. I don't get as many strange looks when I mention we're picking up stuffed grape leaves for dinner. Meatless dolmades are perfect for fast days or Lenten meals. We're right at the beginning of Orthodox Christian Lent, and I've been eating them almost daily. They can be eaten hot or cold, as a side or solo. Dolmades can be found at any respectable Greek, Turkish, Armenian, Syrian, or Lebanese restaurant or festival. You can buy them in cans ready-made from Greek markets. They're not bad at all if you pick the right brand. Ask the storekeeper for the good stuff. Serve with lemon wedges. Of course, they can be found in the markets of the other ethnicities we've mentioned. Homemade is best, though. And honestly, it's worth trying all of them. If you're an adventurous cook without the benefit of a family recipe handed down through the generations, many of the citations on our website episode sources page contain links to articles with recipes from many of the countries who consider dolmades part of their cuisine. Check it out and enjoy. Meanwhile, I'm fascinated with the variety of leaves stuffed by the ancient Greeks. They were using fig leaves, hazelnut leaves, mulberry leaves, sorrel and basil, which sounds awesome, stuffed borage leaves. The Real Greek website mentions simi, cyclamen leaves filled with lentils or fava. They were wrapping food in any leaves they could get their hands on. We'll continue to explore the foods of the ancient world and keep guessing who started what. Thanks for listening. Greek Like Me is a Stealth Greek production. This episode was researched, written, and narrated by me, your host, Pamela Daoudis Wood. Our producer, photographer, and post-production editor is Douglas John. Visit our website at stealthgreek.com for resources, photos, links, and more. Please rate, like, and subscribe. It really helps us to get noticed so we can keep making content about Greeks and Greek culture. Find Greek Like Me on Facebook and on Instagram at Greek_like_me. And our entire podcast catalog is now on YouTube. See you next time. Yassas.